Loops is the most overlooked concept, at least by me, in programming while learning any new programming language. That is because they are almost same in any language. This is the reason why most people overlook it. But while I was going through the docs of Rust in loops page, I found few interesting things and new things in Rust. So this is the reason why I'm making this video actually. Uh, so there are three loops in Rust. Two of them are while and for, which are very common in any language. But there is something called loop. I know it sounds weird, but this has few interesting properties which are not there in other languages. So mostly we will concentrate on this video. So before getting any further, hi, this is Chiranjeevi and you are watching episode 9 of Rush series, and we are going to discuss about loops in this video. So before going further, please like, share and subscribe. Let's just answer to this question, which is why loops? Why do we need loops in programming? So if you remember in the last episode, we took an example of doing CPR, and we wrote something like pressed this many times and with this intensity inside that CPR function. Let's say you want to keep printing, pressing number of times the patient got pressed on his or her chest. So let's say the person who is doing CPR has pressed uh, 20 times on patient chest. So you want to print 20 times pressing 20 times. So if you want to do this, and if we don't know about loops, what we have to do is we have to print pressing and write this like 20 times. This is a painful process. We can't do this. Obviously we have loops for this purpose only, to avoid repetitive printing or repetitive doing of a particular task, not just for printing but for any repetitive task. So if you are repeating code, use loops to avoid that repetition. If you are repeating code, use loops to avoid those repeating conditions. Let's write some code because that's the best way to illustrate about loops. I'm inside my code editor, and inside the projects folder, now I'm creating a new project using cargo new command, and this is named as loops. I'm creating it, so it's created, and I'm opening main.rs file. I'm removing this println hello world. So let's extend on the example of CPR from the previous episode. What are the parameters that depend on the patient's life is the number of times you pressed and with intensity that you pressed. So let's call this function first. First parameter that we are giving is the number of times you pressed. So first one is 20, and the second parameter is the intensity with which you pressed. Let's say for example 7. So you call this function, but this CPR function isn't existing right now. Remember that we created functions using fn keyword and the name of the function, everything. We did that function declaration before the main function, before we called it in the last episode. But that is not the only case how you can declare a function. You can also declare a function after you called it also in the program. Let's say fn cpr, and you have to give parameters here. The first one is number of pressings or presses, and second one is intensity. What is the type of these parameters? Both are i32 because both are numbers. And what is the return type? Currently there is no return type, we are not returning anything, so it's void. We don't need to give anything right now. So you can give the name of the function like this, and you can use it inside main function, because since this is a compiled language, everything is compiled first and then gets used. So even if you have a function declaration after you have used it in main in the terms of code, but in the actual compilation, this will CPR function will get compiled first and it will be used in the main function, but in code you can write it after the call. So that's how it works. So now what we need to do is, let's say we need to print this pressing, and we need to do this for the number of presses, but now we don't know the number of presses. Let's say if we don't get this parameter and we are not sending the number also, we are only sending the intensity in the function call, and let's say for every call we will print 20 times. How will you do that? Without loops, what we can do is we will copy and we can paste it 20 times like this, but this is a heavy process and it's not generic also. What if we want to change this number to 30? We have to copy again and we have to paste 10 times more. So this is not a good way to do this. So what is a good way to do this is using loops. Now we are getting number of presses, which is I32 type, and we are passing the number in the call as well. So now we are getting the number in call, function call. So what we can do is we can loop this and we can put that we need to do this thing for 20 times or number of times the number is passed. So what we can do is, first we will use the loop. So the keyword is loop and we have to open the curly braces. We don't specify anything. Whatever we give inside these curly braces, inside these loop curly braces, it will be executed for infinite number of times. Let's say if I type println pressing, and if I save this and if I run this, cargo run, we just give println pressing inside this and we have called it with some numbers. We don't care because we are not using them anyway inside the function. So if we run this, I have to go to inside these loops, and now if I run this, it's giving output pressing and it's not stopping. It's giving multiple pressings. See, to stop it I have to press Ctrl C. That is because we have put it inside loop. Whatever inside loop will keep executing until the memory itself gets stuck, like if the memory is full. That is because we didn't provide any condition to break this loop. If we don't provide any condition to break this loop, and if that condition is not met inside the program scope, the loop will keep on executing until the computer memory gets full. So this is what we call as infinite loop. So this is what we did actually. This is an infinite loop right now because there is no condition which will break this loop. We have to write some break statement somewhere. Break is a keyword and we will use it. So if I write break right after this println, if we run this now, it printed pressing first and it stopped, but we wrote loop for some reason to repeat the condition and we want to press for number of presses times. So what we can do is we can keep on printing println, but we need to break it sometime. When we need to break it? We need to break it when the number of presses that we have is equal to the number of pressing prints. So if we print pressing for the number of times of number of presses, then we can break this. So how we can track this? We can track this using a variable. Let's take a variable, let mute count. Let's initialize this with 0. So now we have count variable, and every time we print pressing, let's increase this count. How we can do that is using plus equals number of times we want to increase this number every time, which is 1. We want to increase this number by 1 every time we print pressing. So we specify this, and we want to break this at some point, otherwise it will go into infinite loop. How we can do that? Using break statement, but under a specific condition. How we give conditions? Using if count is equal to number of presses, then only we want to break, otherwise let it continue until it meets the condition. So let's save this and run this again. So it exactly printed pressing for 20 times and stopped. That is because now we are keeping track of a count. We started with 0 because initially we didn't press anything. So inside loop, when it pressed for the first time, when the person doing CPR pressed for the first time, we increased the count by 1, and we checked every time. We are checking this condition, if this is equal to number of presses or not, and if it's not equal to the number of presses, we will continue this again. So this will continue until this condition is met. What's happening if this condition is met? If this condition is met, we are breaking out. So we are breaking this loop, so the function will stop. This is what happening inside this loop. So I have said previously that there are few new things in with this loop in Rust, which are not there in other programming languages. The first one is we can return something from this loop. So usually we return something from a function. Usually we don't return anything from a loop, and it's not possible in most programming languages. But in loop in Rust, we can actually return something from the loop actually. Let's say we will only break only when the person becomes alive. So if the person got rid of the heart attack, and if the person is alive, then only we want to break. And while breaking, we want to return outside that if the person is alive or not. So for that, what we can do is we can return either true or false outside that loop, so that the outside that loop knows that if the person is alive or not. So for that, we need to return true or false. So how we can return from the loop is by giving the value beside break. So if you return true, if you type true here, break true, it will return true. Let's see that. Let is alive, which is a boolean. It's going to return boolean, right? That's why I have given bool type here. So equal to this loop. So what? Let's print this. Println. Let's print this variable, which is alive. So if I save this and if we run this, what ideally should happen is it should run this loop for 20 times, and at the 20th time it should break, and while breaking it should return true. And we are saving this true value inside this isAlive variable, and we are printing it. So it should print true at the end of 20 pressing. So let's run this. Somewhere I have missed a semicolon. Oh, okay. Here I have to put a semicolon as well, because that's not the last line of the program. So if you see, it printed pressing for 20 times and true at the end, which means that loop is returning this value. Whatever you want to return, you have to specify it beside break. It was giving some warning every time we compile. That is because we are not using some variables after we declare. It's saying it's not snake case, isAlive is not snake case, so we can avoid these warnings for now. Let's see another unique topic in terms of loops in Rust, which is labeling loops. For that, let's consider this use case where we'll need to perform 3 cycles of CPR, a maximum of 3 cycles, and each cycle means number of presses plus intensity. Let's say in this example, if we consider 7 as intensity and 20 as number of presses, this entire thing, 20 presses with 7 intensity, is called an cycle. So we will print pressing for the number of presses times in each cycle, and we will increase the intensity every cycle. So let's say if we start with 7 intensity, we will increase it 8 for the next cycle, and for the 9 the next cycle. So we will have to return if the patient is alive or not at the end of the function, and at the end of the loop as well, because if we don't know at the end of the loop if the patient is alive or not, we can't return it out of the function. So for this, let's start this writing with we need to keep track of number of cycles, right? So for that, let's take a variable at mute cycles. Let's start with 0 because we haven't performed any cycle yet. And also we have to keep track of number of valid cycles. Valid cycle is nothing but a cycle which has intensity greater than 7. So if the number of valid cycles are at least 2 out of total 3, then only we will consider that patient is alive. Otherwise we consider that patient is dead. So we have to keep track of valid cycles as well. So let's take this variable valid cycles, which is also 0 because we haven't performed any cycle yet. So now let's take a variable is alive, which is going to take the return value from the loop, and we will return this is alive value out of this function so that the main function will know if the patient is alive or not. So this is of type bool because we are going to give a boolean value for this, and this value is coming from the loop. So whatever inside this loop is going to be a cycle. In each iteration of this loop is a cycle. So what do we want to do in each cycle? So we have started a cycle, so let's increment the value cycles with 1. So now the cycles value will become 1. And also now we are inside a cycle. Let's check if the intensity is greater than 7 or not. If the intensity is greater than 7, then only we consider it as a valid cycle, otherwise it's not a valid cycle. So if it is greater than 7, we will increment the valid cycles by 1 as well. So now we have cycles and valid cycles. Now what we have to do is, regardless of it's a valid cycle or not, we will have to perform pressings. So for that we have to write another loop because we want to print pressing those many number of times as number of presses value. So for that we need another loop. Inside this loop we need to print pressing. How many times we need to do this? If we have to track the number of times, we need another variable for this. Let mute count to count the to keep track of the number of printings. So let's take a value count, and we will increase this value every time. Count plus equals 1, and we will do this until if the count is equal to number of presses, then we will break this. Otherwise we'll keep printing pressing and we'll keep increasing the count. This is similar to what we have seen in the previous example. So now we have printed the pressing as well. What we have to do, we have to get out of this loop if the number of cycles are greater than 3. Let's write this. If cycles is greater than 3, we will have to get out of this loop, but we have to specify if the patient is alive or not. So for the condition if the patient is alive or not, we have the valid cycles. If valid cycles is greater than or equal to 2, then the user is then the patient is alive. So we can break with true value because the patient is alive. If the valid cycles is not greater than or equal to 2, if it's less than 2, if it is 1 only, then we have to break this with false. So this will return false from the loop. Now if we after this entire loop is done, we have a loop, and inside the loop we have another loop. This is what we call as nested loops because one loop is nested inside other loop. So after this entire loop is done, we'll return this is alive value, and we have to keep semicolons at the end of the loops as well. Don't forget that this has given an error before for us, and we are pretty much done. We are returning a value here is alive. Is alive is of type bool. We forgot to specify a return type for this function, otherwise it will give an error. We'll have to specify that we are returning bool out of this function. We are almost done with this. Yeah, we are done. So we are keeping track of cycles, and similarly here we are keeping track of valid cycles. Inside this loop we are incrementing cycle every time and checking if valid cycle or not. Later what we are doing is, in this loop, pressing for number of presses times. So for the number of presses times we are pressing. Here we are returning value if patient is alive or not. If the valid cycles are greater than or equal to 2, then the patient is alive. Otherwise, the patient is not alive. So what we can do here is, we can use print ln, and using placeholder we can print the CBR function here. So what it will print is, it will print either true or false. If it is true, that means the patient is alive. If it is false, then it means that patient is not alive. So let's save this, and hopefully there won't be any errors. Let's run this cargo run. It's saying it printed pressing a lot many times, because we have 3 cycles. For each cycle it will print 20 times, so we have a lot many pressing, and at the end it's saying it's false. Why? Because we have passed initial intensity as 7. So for the first cycle the initial intensity is 7, and the second we have passed intensity 7 initially. So for the next cycle it should be 8, and the other cycle it should be 9. So we have total 2 valid cycles, so it should print true actually, but it printed false because we have a small bug. What we have said before is, we have to increase intensity every cycle, and we are checking that if the intensity is greater than or not, but we forgot to increment that intensity every cycle. So what we have to do is, we have to increment this intensity every time. Since we have to increment the intensity, and the intensity initially is not a mutable variable. This is coming from outside of this function, and we are not specifying this mutability of this variable, so it won't be mutable to increment the value. So for that, what we can do is, either we have to pass the address of that variable while calling the function, and we have to take the address here, or simply what we can do is, we can take another variable. Let's call this intensity mute, and let's assign the intensity value to this, and let's use this intensity mute everywhere, so that we can increment this value without any error. So intensity mute plus equals 1. So this should skip semicolon here also. So this should work fine now. Let's try run this. Go run. So it printed pressing for 60 times, because we have 3 cycles, and for every cycle there are 20 pressing, and we got true at the end. When we are using multiple loops and the loops are nested, we will have multiple break statements, which can make confusing if the break is of the inner loop or for the outer loop. So for that, what we can do is, we can give label to the loops. So if we can give outer loop a label, which can be anything, we can name it anything. Let's call this as cycle loop, and we have to specify colon here. And if we do this, what we are doing is, we are giving the label to this outside loop, outer loop. Since it's going to deal with the cycles, we are giving it as cycle label. So while writing, what we can do is, we can specify the name of the label of the loop, which is cycle in this case, and here also we can do the same, because both are returning for the cycle loop. Now if we save this, and if we run this, it's giving the same output. But if you see, we can, out of the multiple break statements, we can specify that this break statement is of this inner loop, and this break statement is for the outer loop. which has the label cycle. So this is a useful thing when we are trying to loop, when we are trying to nest multiple loops inside one another. Let me quickly go through the other type of loops which are while and for without any example, because example takes some time to understand. Let's just write some basic loops using this while and for. Let's see when while is useful. While is useful when we have a condition to be met to exit out of the loop. Let's say we have a condition, whenever it is true, the loop should until it is true, the loop should continue. If it is false, the loop should end. So while is the keyword we use for it, and we have to give some condition here, and after the condition we have to give curly braces, and inside the curly braces we will give whatever we want to loop. So let's say we have a variable, let mute count equal to 0, and we want to loop until this count is less than 5, less than or equal to 5. So if it is greater than 5, the loop should end. It should only run until the count is less than or equal to 5. So let's print the count now, whatever count that is at that point, and let's increment the count each time. So let's save this and run this. It printed 0 1 2 3 4 5 because the count is initially 0, and it enters the loop, it prints, and it will increment the value, and it will come again because the condition is true, and it will print again, and it will increment again. It will continue until the count is greater than 5. Once the count comes to the 6, the condition will be false, and it won't execute anymore, and it will exit. So that's how while loop works. Use while loop when you have a predefined condition when you want to exit the loop. Another example is a for loop. It is normal for loop. Actually, we call this as for each loop in other programming languages. So whenever we have a collection, let's say we have a array, let's call this as let arr equal to, let's give some values to this, 10 20 30. Let's say this is an array is a group of values. If you don't know about arrays, check out the episode which has complex data types, and you will know about it. So when we have complex data types like this, we can loop through each of them. Let's say we want to go through 10 20 30, and we want to do some calculation over it. So we can use for loop at that time. What we can do is for in curly braces. So in which thing you want to loop, we want to loop through arr. So in arr, so let's call this as element. So for element in arr, which means the element will take 10 for the first time, 20 for the second time, and 30 for the third time. So we are just giving any name. We can give any name here for calling each element inside the arr. And let's just print this value, element. So if you save this and run this, it printed 10 20 30. You can call it any name. If you want to call it ele, just ele, you can call that and save it. So basically for ele in arr, so this ele will take each value every time inside the array. Instead of arrays, you can also take other things like you can take a range as well. A range is something which is given inside the parenthesis, and you will specify the first item in the range. Let's say the range starts from 10 and it goes till 20. So you will specify a range with 2 dots, and the range is from 10 to 20. Now if you save this and run this, you will see that it printed from, oh, it's saying that we can remove this parenthesis, so not a big deal, it's just a warning, doesn't matter. So if you see, it started from 10 and it went to 20, and 20 is not included in the range. Only first one will be included and the last one will be excluded from the range. So you can use this for loop whenever you want to loop through a particular collection or a range using this for loop. That's it for this video. Make sure you like, share and subscribe to this channel so that you will see future episodes of Rush series, in which we are going to go through the Rush specific concepts like borrowing and referencing and ownership of the variables. So stay tuned for those videos. Until then, bye bye.